Welcome to week 1, and this week we'll be talking about the False Claims Act. So the False Claims Act is the most powerful tool that the government has in fighting fraud, waste, and abuse in federal health care programs such as Medicare and Medicaid. And the False Claim Act was enacted by Congress in 1863 at the height of the American Civil War. Some people refer to it as Abraham Lincoln's Law or just Lincoln's Law because it was President Lincoln who put this act into place. In prosecuting that war, the federal government used a large number of private contractors, and the private contractors took advantage of the crisis situation and made false claims to the government for payment, such as selling sawdust instead of gunpowder and selling bad leather shoes to the troops, and they fell apart very quickly. So the False Claim Act was designed to address those types of abuses. So what does the False Claim Act prohibit, and how does it work? Well, the False Claim Act prohibits the knowingly submission of false claims for payment, the knowing use of false records or statements to support those claims, the knowing and improper retention of money that's owed or belonging to the federal government, or even conspiring with others to commit any of those acts. Also, any person who knowingly presents or causes to be presented a false or fraudulent claim for payment is liable to the United States government. An example of a False Claim Act liability would be, for example, a provider submits a claim for Medicare or Medicaid, in California we call it Medi-Cal, for services that were not medically necessary or for services that were not performed. Any person who knowingly makes, uses, or causes to be made or used as false record or statement material to a false or fraudulent claim is liable to the United States government. So for an example, a medical record may be altered to show that the procedure was medically necessary, or the medical record might be altered to show that the service was performed when in fact no service was performed, or maybe to show that a different service was performed than the one that was actually performed. Any person who knowingly makes, uses, or causes to be made or used a false record or statement material to an obligation to pay or transmit money or property to the government, or knowingly conceals or knowingly and improperly avoids an obligation to pay money back to the government is liable to the United States government. So for example, if a provider has received an overpayment, the provider must pay back the amount of the overpayment. A false claim liability happens when the provider tries to conceal or avoid the obligation to make that repayment. Any person who knowingly conspires to commit a violation is liable to the United States government. So for example, a physician and maybe a diagnostic lab might agree to submit claims for tests that were necessary or never performed, or a hospital and a physician might agree to provide medically unnecessary services to a patient. They would be considered false claims. So whether a claim is false or not really depends upon the application of the statute and regulation. But minor technical violations of federal laws and regulations do not result in a false claim unless the violations are material to the payment. Making billing mistakes is not considered a false claim. And healthcare professionals won't be held liable for reasonable interpretations of laws and regulations. But the term knowingly attempts to define the necessary state of mind of the person submitting the claim. The person either must have actual knowledge that the claim or the information behind it is false, or must act in deliberate ignorance or reckless disregard. It is not necessary to prove a specific intent to defraud in order to find violation of the law. Now, the primary responsibility for enforcing the False Claim Act lies with the Department of Justice. So, in addition, the False Claim Act specifically provides that a private citizen, myself, like you, may bring a lawsuit on behalf of the United States when he or she has information that an individual or organization has knowingly submitted or caused to be submitted a false claim. The term is qui tam, and that is Latin for who is well. The person that brings the claim to the government is known as a whistleblower or a relator, and the relator must be represented by an attorney, and the legal complaint must be filed under seal, which means it's not open to the public. And the government may decide to intervene or not intervene, or the government may decide to only intervene in a portion of the complaint. So the relator, if the government does take the case and monies are recovered, the relator can be rewarded anywhere from 15 to 30% of the money recovered. Now, the defendant, if found guilty of violating the False Claim Act, for example, a hospital or a physician, may be temporarily or permanently suspended from participating in federal health care programs. A person that is found liable under the False Claim Act will be required to pay the damages that he or she has caused to the federal government. And the damages are the difference between what the government paid to the person and what it would have paid without the False Claim Act violation. In addition, the amount of the actual damages are tripled. So let's take for an example, a physician filed 1,000 improperly upcoded claims for an average gain of $50. The damages that he or she will then owe the government would be 1,000 times the 50, but tripled, which now makes it $150,000. But the court may also assess a penalty, anywhere from $5,500 to $11,000 for each false claim. So using that same example of the 1,000 false claims, a convicted person, organization, would be subject to 1,000 times $5,500, which equates to $5,500,000 in penalties, and that's at a minimum. Now, there are some cases in which the false claim is actually considered a felony, and the person could go to prison and also pay fines up to $25,000. Some of the actions that are considered felonies would be making false statements or representation, making false statements relating to qualifications for participation in the government program. For instance, hiring non-trained personnel that are not enrolled in the Medicare program, and also criminal health care fraud. Whoever knowingly and willfully executes or attempts to execute a scheme. Another felony would be obstructing statements to a criminal investigator. There are certain areas that healthcare providers are at risk for. So, for example, filing a claim for services that were never delivered, or filing a claim for healthcare services or tests, etc., that did not exist, or billing for a patient who never received the services that were billed. Anti-kickback violations. It has been accepted that violations of the federal anti-kickback statute may also be considered violations of the False Claim Act. So the anti-kickback law prohibits an offer, a payment, solicitation, or receipt of money or property in order to induce or reward the referral of a patient. Upcoding of service claims. So that would be, as an example, billing for a higher level of service than the level that was performed. Unbundling of related services. A provider may attempt to collect a higher reimbursement for billing for the services individually as opposed to one comprehensive service. Billing for services that are medically unnecessary. And also inappropriate physician investments. So the federal Stark law prohibits physicians from referring patients to or ordering goods from entities in which there is an investment or a compensation relationship. Filing a false cost report. Hospitals that participate in the Medicare program have to periodically report on their costs and their charges and their revenues as well as profits. And this report is then what Medicare uses to determine how much it will reimburse the hospitals. So a hospital may falsely report higher costs in order to gain higher reimbursement. Then, of course, there's illegal kickbacks. So an illegal kickback would be, as an example, charging excessive fees for speaking engagements or providing services to physicians at prices below cost or market value. Pharmaceutical companies might want to entice a physician to use a certain drug, and by enticing the physician, they might give the physician, say, expensive trips or tickets to the Super Bowl or something to that effect. So how much does healthcare fraud cost? To give you an example, in 2010, there was approximately 80%, well, there was about $3 billion of False Claims Act settlements. And of that $3 billion, approximately 80% were settlements and judgments based on whistleblowers. Now, the Department of Justice receives referrals on potential fraud and abuse cases from regular consumers, from the National Institutes of Health, as well as the FBI. In order to minimize exposure to the False Claim Act, every honorable, well-managed healthcare person or organization should have a compliance program. And the purpose is to encourage ethical behavior. There are basic principles of compliance, and they are set out in the federal sentencing guidelines. And under these guidelines, the organization should develop and distribute written standards of conduct, as well as policies and procedures, have a designated compliance officer, develop and implement the appropriate education and training. They should implement a process for identifying and reporting violations, and they should develop a protocol for handling any allegations of improper actions, followed by any appropriate discipline. There should be a mechanism for auditing and monitoring the system. They should investigate and correct system problems that arise. They should develop policies for dealing with employees who commit prohibited acts, and they should also identify and implement any current best practices for the compliance function. I would encourage all of you to go on Google and type in the False Claim Act, as well as you could go to the Department of Justice website and see some recent cases that have been brought forth. But in the meantime, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.